Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Anthony Brown, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending this evening's panel discussion entitled The American Immigration Dilemma. I'd like to welcome all of you to the ARCO Forum of Public Affairs. This evening's panel discussion is sponsored by the Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics. Before we begin with tonight's event, I'd first like to thank my co-coordinator, Kenneth Luard, the several members on the Special Projects Committee, and the staff in the Forum Office. Without further delay, I'm going to turn this evening's event over to Professor Stephen Cornell. Professor Cornell is a member of Harvard University's Sociology Department and will be this evening's coordinator. Mr. Cornell, Professor Cornell.
Thank you. Well, I just have a few remarks to make before we turn to our panelists. First of all, I want to thank the Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics for their efforts in arranging for this panel discussion of the American immigration dilemma. We're gathered here tonight to discuss an issue which has both historical and contemporary significance. Periodically in American history, immigration policy has become an item of intense and heated debate. In the 1880s, in the post-World War I period, in the early 1950s, again in the mid-1960s, the influx of foreign nationals into this country, either as workers or as refugees, has prompted considerable public attention, certain kinds of legislative activity, political controversy, and not infrequently a good deal of violent protest. And now in the late 70s and early 80s, we find that immigration has again moved to the center of the political arena, and there seem to be 4 or 5 events or developments which are centrally responsible for the recent controversy, the current controversy. The first, I think, is the extraordinary rise since the mid-1960s of undocumented immigration to the United States, particularly but not exclusively from Mexico. Just how many undocumented migrants actually live in the United States now is difficult to say. Some estimates are as low as 3 million, some are as high as 12 million. Second, since the withdrawal of the United States from Southeast Asia in 1975, something like 500,000 Indo-Chinese refugees have entered the country. Small numbers continue to arrive. Third, the Cuban boat lift of 1980 brought about 125,000 Cubans to South Florida and distributed them in different parts of the United States. And both the circumstances under which those migrants came and the nature of many of the migrants themselves aroused a number of passionate constituencies. Fourth, there's the current and widely publicized attempts by relatively small but potentially very large numbers of Haitians to enter the United States. And finally, we have the disarray within the immigration bureaucracy itself and the apparent incapacity of the United States to keep track even of those who enter the country legally, an incapacity which was made most apparent during the recent Iranian crisis when the government attempted futilely to determine just how many foreign students there were in the country. And these events and developments have aroused a considerable and ongoing debate which involves, interestingly enough, many of the same actors that have been involved in previous debates in years past over immigration. Workers who feel their jobs are threatened, citizens who feel that in one way or another their civilization is threatened, employers who believe that their own labor force is threatened by any change in immigration policy, migrants who are already here and find their own position and fortunes threatened by the backlash against the racial groups who are most involved in migration, and also policymakers themselves who are trying to find a workable approach to the problem that will satisfy the various interests that they represent. And it's a debate which seems likely to continue for some time because given the economic and political uncertainties of the modern world, it doesn't seem likely that the pressure on the U.S. borders is going to diminish anytime soon. So that under the circumstances, it's not surprising that the Reagan administration arrived in Washington with a commitment to what Attorney General William French Smith called a major overhaul of immigration policy, a commitment which in one way or another has largely been shared by much of the U.S. Congress. So the issue we take up tonight is one very much of immediate significance. And indeed, this is an opportune time to take up this issue because within the last 2 weeks, the Reagan administration has put forward its own legislative proposals for immigration policy, and I expect those proposals will be one of the central topics of our discussion tonight. As for the discussion itself, we have 4 panelists, and I'll introduce all of them before putting the first one of them to work. Starting on my immediate left, David Hiller is a graduate of Harvard University and of the Harvard Law School. He has experience both in private legal practice and as a law clerk, including a stint as clerk to Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. Mr. Hiller is currently Special Assistant to the United States Attorney General. Next to him is Michael Piori, also a Harvard graduate who did both his bachelor's and his doctoral degrees here. Professor Piori is a professor of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's done extensive work on migrant labor and on dual labor markets, and is the author of the 1979 book Birds of Passage, Migrant Labor and Industrial Societies. Next to him is Julian Sashnik, did an undergraduate degree at Brandeis, a law degree from Boston University. He's a Boston lawyer who recently left private practice to become vice president and general counsel of an electronics firm in the Boston area. Mr. Sashnik has extensive experience as a defense counsel in immigration-related litigation. He's written on immigration law, and he's a former chairman of the New England chapter of the Immigration Lawyers Association. And at the far end is Rick Schwartz, who's also a lawyer, a graduate of Amherst with a law degree from the University of Chicago. He was for 3 years director of the Alien Rights Law Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and he's a founding member of the National Forum on Immigration and Refugee Policy, which was just founded this past summer. The procedure we'll follow is let each of the 4 panelists make a presentation of some 10 to 15 minutes or so. After all 4 have done so, we'll find out if any of the 4 wants to reply to the others and give them each 2 or 3 minutes in which to do so, and then turn the discussion over to you to find out what questions you have. Given that the Reagan administration's legislative proposals for immigration policy have just recently been put forward, I thought it would be appropriate if we began tonight by hearing from one of the architects of those proposals, the Special Assistant to the Attorney General, David Hiller. Mr. Hiller.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Nice to be back. I'm not sure. I'll probably have to wait until after the discussion is concluded to tell you whether I want to accept the appellation of one of the architects of the administration's policy, but tentatively I'll accept that for now. I was even wondering why, as I was coming up here, I'm given the only person with a different colored chair. All of this is beginning to make me sort of wary about beginning. And I can tell you from having chatted with some of the other panelists before the session that we're going to have a very spirited discussion of what the administration has put forward. But in keeping with all that vulnerability, I guess I will take your invitation and go first. When the administration came into office in January, one of the issues that the President very quickly wanted the Cabinet and led by the Attorney General to take up was immigration. As you pointed out, there have been a number of recent episodes that have underscored for most of the American public the degree to which, as the Attorney General often says, that the United States has lost control of its borders. It, as I say, was punctuated recently by the arrival of 125,000 Cubans during 1980 and the Cuban boat lift, the ongoing smaller flows, which, however, are concentrated in the southeast, persons coming from Haiti, some of the domestic problems that have been presented by our quite large and really quite generous refugee program, which has, however, resulted in quite unequal burdens across the United States, more than half of the refugees having settled in just a handful of states and barely more than a handful of counties in those states. But perceiving that the state of the law was in some disarray and the state of the administrative practices of the Immigration Service were notoriously in greater disarray, in March the President asked the Attorney General to chair a task force which then met within the Cabinet for several months, and at the end of July proposed a series of administrative and legal revisions to our immigration policy that have recently been embodied in an Omnibus Immigration Control Act, an act we hope that will in some similar form be enacted sometime next year. The numbers, which, as you point out, are somewhat guesswork, are, at least most would agree, devastatingly large. The estimates that we have been using and referring to are that there may be between 3.5 and 6 million illegal aliens present in the United States. Others, with just as much credibility, in my opinion, say that the number could be well in excess of 10 million. We really don't know. What we do know is that the number is increasing quite substantially each year, that there may be between a million and 1.5 million persons who enter the country illegally. Not all of them stay, of course, but perhaps as many as 500,000 of them do each year. And that this is creating an ever-increasing illegal shadow population, persons who may to some extent, although again here the data is not very certain, may be depressing the wages of American workers, to some extent may be displacing some American workers. They're often afraid, quite understandably, to bring their problems to the attention of legal authorities so that they become prey for unscrupulous employers and other persons that they come into contact with. They are reluctant to make use of public health facilities, and in some parts of the country may now or in the future present an increasing public health risk. And generally, both among themselves and among Americans who have viewed the collapse of our immigration policy, breed a cynicism about the enforcement of the United States laws. We have laws on the books that are plainly not being enforced. And regrettably, in recent years, through the neglect of the Immigration Service, the agency that's charged with the administration of those laws is just in tatters. Too little money has been provided to it. It has far too few people. And the discussion, including the administration's discussion of what policy changes we might suggest, are going to be entirely beside the point if we don't build an organization within the Immigration Service that's capable of enforcing whatever the laws are. Now, turning to the particular recommendations that the administration has made, they fall into a few categories. We view the centerpiece of the package of proposals as the employer sanctions law. We're proposing that it be made illegal for employers to knowingly hire illegal aliens. It seemed to the Cabinet, which, as you know, is not a group that in this administration that lightly would resort to additional penalties or administrative burdens being placed on employers, but it was eventually they determined that the only possible way to curtail the flow of illegal aliens into the United States is to cut off the opportunity that now exists to work here without regard to legal status at wage rates that are 5, 6, 7, 10 times the wages that are available in their home country. The forces, the economic forces that drive people to come to the United States outside of our normal immigration laws are immense. And although to be sure we have to add people and funding to the Immigration Service for its conventional enforcement efforts, the Border Patrol and area control and the like, as long as there's the possibility for people to come into the United States and work, it's simply unrealistic to think that the border can be sealed. And anywhere near the militarization of the borders that it would take to make even a half-hearted effort to cut off at the borders the people entering the country would be largely unacceptable, both domestically and would present enormous problems to us diplomatically. So we do view the centerpiece of our program is a law that would forbid persons to knowingly hire illegal aliens. As we propose it, if you violated that statute, there would be civil penalties of between $500 and $1,000 for each instance of an illegal alien hired. For those who persisted in a practice of hiring illegal aliens, the Department of Justice would be authorized to seek injunctions against that, the continued violation of which would result in contempt and that sort of thing. We, as may come out later, we have exempted from the coverage of that act employers of 3 or fewer employees. The reason for that was essentially administrative economy. In broadest terms, that exempts 50% of all employers in the United States, roughly. It exempts only 5% of the employees. Now, it's altogether likely that illegal aliens are somewhat disproportionately employed in the smaller enterprises, so it may be that somewhat more than 5% of the illegal aliens are in that exempted category, but the number would have to be overwhelming to make the savings in the administration of the Act not a sensible thing to do. The Cabinet determined that it wanted, at this point at least, to not identify or create a single new national identification card or improved Social Security card to be used as the document to determine worker eligibility. The reason for that was principally one of cost. The estimates are that to do that and reissue it to all Americans would cost between $1 billion and $2 billion, is a General Accounting Office estimate. And it may be that with experience we'll determine that existing forms of identification may be so subject to counterfeiting and fraud and the like that we'd choose to tighten up one of them or create a new identification scheme. In the meanwhile, and in any case, until you had a new system into place, you'd be compelled to rely on existing forms of identification like the Social Security card and birth certificates and the like. The second, but in many ways equally important element of the program is to turn the Immigration Service into an agency that can enforce the law. It can't do it now. It doesn't have enough people, and we are working both from an organizational management point of view and also from a budget view to increasing the capabilities of the Immigration Service. The Immigration Service has been exempted from the President's budget cuts. In fact, our most recent budget amendment that was, in fact, I believe it was introduced on the floor of the House today, would add $108 million to the approximately $300 million budget of the Immigration Service, which would increase its budget by approximately, something under 30%, but around 30%. That's absolutely essential, and we're hoping for whatever schedule these other items are on in the Congress. We're hoping very much that the additional money for the Immigration Service will be forthcoming very soon. Finally, or third, I should say, to deal with the large pool of illegal aliens who are now residing in the United States, the Cabinet and the President has decided that some form of legal status would be appropriate to them. We didn't think that it would either be possible or certainly not humane to try and uproot and deport several million persons, many of whom have already become well-settled members of their communities. There is going to be an enormous administrative burden involved in adjusting the status of that number of people. For that, too, additional personnel will have to be sought for the Immigration Service. We've proposed, just to mention a detail or two of the legalization, to give them at first what's called a temporary resident status, and that would permit them to remain in the United States, would secure to them the full protection of the laws governing workers and other laws in the country. We have said that not until they've been in the country for 10 years, however, can they become full permanent resident aliens. That's a somewhat controversial provision, at least with those who are hoping that these people would be given immediately a more permanent legal status, and it's a matter that the Congress is going to have to wrestle with. Finally, we've proposed that for a 2-year period we would experiment with the admissions of temporary workers, just a very small number in the first 2 trial years, to see first whether there's an identifiable labor need in some parts of the country or in certain occupations, and also to see whether, again, that's a program that can be administered by the Immigration Service without adversely affecting American workers, and also in a way to see that the guest workers leave the country at the end of their temporary visa stay. All in all, the 4 of those provisions together, we think and hope and are going to work at it so that it works out that way, will be sufficient to substantially curtail the illegal immigration into the United States, at the same time that it expands somewhat the opportunity for people to work in the United States legally, both those who are now illegal residents here and those who would be enrolled in the temporary worker program. But we await congressional action. The bill was submitted 2 weeks ago. We're in the midst of a rather vigorous set of hearings on each of those points in the package, and we're very eager for congressional action sometime in the spring. But before that occurs, there'll have to be a good deal more public debate than has occurred to date, including such evenings as tonight.
Refrain from giving you full responsibility for the proposals. Thanks very much. Our second panelist is Rick Schwartz from the National Forum on Immigration and Refugee Policy.
Maybe I do have to sit down. Does the President have something to do with this, David? What I thought I would do tonight is focus on one particular issue in this package that the administration has proposed, indeed one that David didn't talk about. I'm not sure why exactly. It has to do with the response to the United States being what's known as a country of first asylum. That is, people coming directly to our shores seeking refuge or political asylum, Haitians, Cubans, Salvadorians. And there are some very significant proposals that have been made in this area, and it's an area in which I've worked quite a bit, primarily as an attorney representing Haitian refugees in litigation in Florida and also in advocacy on a range of issues in Washington. And that's the issue I'd like to use and to focus my discussion. But in so doing, what I thought I would try to provide as an overview is some insight, at least from somebody who's been in the middle of the process that David described, of what the character of that process is. Immigration is an issue of governance, the difficulty of governing in this area, of developing policy and then of implementing policy. An attempt to offer some suggestions of themes or patterns, both ethical and institutional and legal, which seem to affect considerably the efforts to govern with regard to immigration, refugee, and related foreign policy issues. And just really kind of identify some of these themes and explain what I mean by them, and then use the Haitian issue in particular to try to illustrate what I'm talking about. The kinds of themes I would suggest are relevant here to looking at how we govern or try to govern this area are among the following. The breadth and complexity of the issues. Immigration and refugee policy involves all sorts of things. Political and economic conditions in El Salvador or in Haiti or in Indochina, military, national security considerations, etc., are having an impact in Southern California and in Florida. What's happening abroad is being felt in very direct ways through migration and domestic communities. And we have in many particulars a substantial overlap of foreign policy and domestic policy issues, considerations, and institutional actors. I think it's very important to keep in mind, in particular for the following kinds of reasons. It complicates the politics of the issue. Tremendous diversity of, just on the domestic side, of political actors concerned with immigration, ethnic groups, and then you can start naming them. Polish American communities, Lithuanian groups, the American Jewish community, the Hispanic community, the American black community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Range of different ethnic racial groups have a very big stake in the immigration issue. For the business community, in many, many ways, whether it's needing certain kinds of skills that they believe in short supply, concern about political stability abroad and security of investments abroad, and how migration either within certain countries from rural areas to urban areas may either enhance the opportunities for investment or raise questions about the security of business investments, the availability of labor in large numbers in certain parts of the country, guest worker program addressing, for example, assertions that in certain parts of the country, in certain industries, there's a real lack of available labor, and that the immigration policy has to address that. State and local government, in very, very significant ways, and increasingly impacted by migration for obvious reasons, but some particular issues may be leading to some new institutional participation by state and local government in the political process. One of the things David, I don't think, mentioned with regard to the legalization plan, but let me describe it to then make a point, is that the estimated 3 to 10 million undocumenteds that might be eligible for legalization, if they came forward, as David indicated, would have to be in the country a total of 10 years before they could become permanent resident aliens, which is sort of the highest status that an alien can have. During that 10-year period, they would be ineligible for any federal benefit programs. I think there may be a Medicare or Medicaid exception to that, but they'd be ineligible. Now, as a matter of constitutional law, the federal government probably can do that. The Supreme Court has decided in a couple of different cases that the federal government can indeed restrict alien eligibility to federal benefit programs. However, the states don't have anywhere near the same kind of constitutional flexibility, and the Supreme Court has decided that. So you had virtually identical benefit programs, one on a state level, one on a federal level, restricting alien eligibility. The state effort struck down on constitutional ground, the federal effort upheld. Now, I go through all of that because under the amnesty or legalization program, if enacted, state and local governments are going to be left having to provide for the health care, for the food needs, for the social service needs, et cetera, to a almost exclusive extent for these newly legalized aliens. And we're talking about, I think, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of cost to state and local governments and state and local taxpayers that they believe are a federal responsibility, that immigration is a plenary federal matter, that the feds ought to pick up the bill. It's a principle that's been pretty well established, although recently, in the refugee area. And for refugees, they have special benefit eligibility for the first 3 years they're here, and then the same eligibility as, by and large, as citizens thereafter. But for those first 3 years, there's a program of 100% federal reimbursement to states and localities of the cost to the states. Not all the costs, not the hidden costs, but the sort of broad programmatic costs of the states, having refugees and local governments, having refugees in their communities. And that is, as David Wells knows, a very hard, hot political issue in Washington. Who's going to pay the bill? Now, state and local governments are also beginning to get active in foreign policy. It's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but my instincts are that the sharpness of this new interest in foreign policy may be somewhat new, may be very interesting and politically important down the road. Why? Because they're being impacted in their communities. They don't think the federal government has any control over immigration. Indeed, they don't think there's a policy whatsoever. They recognize that the economic and political conditions in the sending countries have direct relevance to the self-interest of local communities, and they're beginning to start to say some things about foreign policy. The very first sentence in the National Association of Counties Task Force Report on Migration, for example, is, for perhaps the first time in history, local government is staking a claim in foreign policy. Governor Graham just went to Haiti to talk about, the governor of Florida, to talk about economic development in Haiti. Governor Clements, the governor of Texas, and the other southwest border governors increasingly are having meetings with their counterparts in Mexico, increasingly are developing policy ideas and putting some of their political muscle behind it on foreign policy initiatives to deal with migration. Now, state and local governments are a very powerful political force in this country. Some might argue, indeed, that they're perhaps the backbone of our political system, that those are the party people at the local levels who play such a critical role. Their perspective, in my experience, on issues is often a very pragmatic one. Certainly their self-interest in foreign policy is very different than the defense industry or that the traditional power groups that have influenced foreign policy. Migration may begin to get them involved, but state and local government and their role in this is, I think, a very important one. And it complicates the process. Somewhat along these same lines, the diversity of groups, the overlap of issues. There's no real governing center in Washington on immigration and refugee issues. 7 or 8 different agencies have significant responsibilities for various elements of the policy. The Reagan administration has not yet put in place its top-level appointments in this area. There's yet no U.S. coordinator for refugees. I think a name's been recently sent up, but no nominations. Similarly with the Commissioner of INS, name now sent up. There's not been a Commissioner of INS for over 2 years. Increasingly, because of the overlap of issues, the White House ends up resolving issues. During the Haitian-Cuban crisis in particular, the White House became the locus of activity. But that, given the governing structure, the character of the bureaucracies at that time and how they interrelated, I'm not sure that that was such a good idea. It became inevitable because there was no other center, because you had military options being looked at with regard to the Cuban exodus. You had a range of problems with regard to the Haitians. You had all this state and local government impact. You had questions of benefit eligibility. Where were people going to be housed? What kind of camps were going to be set up? The politics of it became more and more intense. Boom, became increasingly a White House issue and increasingly a politicized issue, with a lot of the actual decisions made at very high levels in the White House, even if it dealt with a relatively minor question like what the identity cards for Haitians and Cubans might talk about or might actually say. I think some very serious questions need to be raised and examined as we're looking at these other issues about how we attempt to govern and what the institutional arrangements or relationships are, which affect so much what policies ultimately are developed and then who implements them and how they're implemented. The role of the courts is an institutional matter. It's very important. And among the proposals the administration has made that David did not describe were proposals to severely restrict access to the courts by aliens in different kinds of postures, and I'm not going to get into detail on that, although I think you'll hear about it before the night's over. Restrict the availability or the practical ability of lawyers to provide effective legal representation. Part of that, I think, is an outgrowth of the fact that the courts have played a more active role on due process issues, in particular, on access to public education of undocumented aliens, a major Supreme Court case now about to be heard, certainly in the Haitian situation, and the courts, too, in part through the immigration issue, beginning to say and do some different things with regard to foreign policy issues. And I think that has stimulated, the concern about the courts and foreign policy may have stimulated some of these proposals. Finally, there are a range of moral, ethical questions that this issue presents. Should illegal aliens have access to free public health care, let's say, in Los Angeles? A major issue. The Los Angeles County Supervisors have recently adopted a policy, or at least debated a policy, saying no, you're not here legally. Public hospitals have no right, or no obligation, rather, to serve you, and we are prepared to turn you away, even if you may be dying on the hospital steps. Now, it sounds severe. It reflects to some extent the great fiscal impact on local governments, a growing resentment on the local level of immigrants and refugees, but it also presents, it seems to me, some ethical questions that the society of ours ought to squarely face, and I could go on and giving examples that are more severe than that one. The style of the politics in this area, I think, is very important. As mentioned in the introduction, there have been a number of eras in American history, the late 1890s after the First World War, early 1950s, when we've engaged in a fairly comprehensive reexamination of our immigration and refugee policies. Often, and again today, those have been times of economic uncertainty, high unemployment. Aliens and refugees become scapegoats for the rest of our problems. To some extent, they may be contributing to the problems. That's one element of this debate. Are immigrants, illegal or otherwise, taking jobs away? Is there a displacement factor? What's the evidence on newcomers actually creating jobs? I was just at a 4-day conference the last couple of days, and it was argued there that refugees are creating 1.2 jobs, in effect, for every job that they're taking. In other words, they're not displacing. The economic activity that they're engaged in is actually resulting in a net increase in the employment opportunities available to all of us. Now, I don't know if that's right or wrong, or what that conclusion, what kind of study that is based upon, but the debate includes a lot of factual questions, debates among academics about what the facts are, and increasingly backlash and resentment, which is really having an effect, in my judgment, on the policy process. South Florida is just a minefield. It is vicious down there. It cannot be overstated. I know it. David knows it. It's a very serious public problem. I've tried in many respects to get the Haitian leadership to agree to resettlement of Haitians out of Miami on terms that they might ideally not find acceptable, if only to try to alleviate some of that pressure that they're facing down there. But that backlash is also skewing how the federal policymakers are approaching this issue. Governor Graham is a Democrat. He's up for re-election next year. Senator Childs is a Democrat. He's up for re-election next year. Florida's a key state in the Republican-Democratic struggle and looking long-term. And increasingly, the calls from the public officials out of Florida are do anything you can to get rid of these people. Do anything you can to keep them off our shores. One of the resulting policies, interdiction of boats on the high seas. Turn them back before they reach our shores. And I think to a fair extent, the resentment and the public officials' reactions to it reinforces it and makes rational policy development and debate more difficult, and is resulting, as I'll try to explain in somewhat greater detail, perhaps during questions, in real problems in the policy-making process and specific policies that don't make any sense. Just don't make any sense. More reaction to the intensity of the resentment. Finally, looking long-term, is suggested with Florida in other respects, the immigration issue has partisan political significance. The demographics suggest that 50% of our current population growth now is attributable to immigration. A lot of that is Hispanic, not all. Mexicans are less than 50% of the undocumented aliens in this country. That's important always to remember. It's not just Mexicans by any means. There are thousands of Canadians living illegally in Miami. Nobody ever hears about them, but they're there. But in the Southwest, looking at the demographics and looking to the future of Republican-Democratic politics in this country, that Southwest vote is going to be increasingly important in the West Coast. Increasingly, those voters are going to be newcomers or first-generation descendants of newcomers, and both parties, I think, are well aware of that, and that increasingly this may become a partisan issue, even though traditionally it has not been. Now, I probably ought to stop because I've been talking about 15 minutes, but very quickly on the Haitians to try to illustrate some of these themes. Why are people leaving Haiti? Government's official position, economic reasons, they're seeking jobs, it's poverty. Interesting point to note, seems to me, is that Haitians did not start coming into South Florida by boat until 1972. And Haiti was desperately poor long before 1972. Miami was nirvana by comparison long before 1972. Something happened inside Haiti. I won't go into details of what happened. Our analysis is, though, that practices of the security forces in Haiti changed. They increasingly engaged in their extortion, theft. Haiti's been called the regime. One way to characterize the regime would be as a kleptocracy. A government that steals from its people. And, I could illustrate that in a number of ways. But obviously, what is happening inside of Haiti is having significant impact on South Florida. And in my judgment, the government is being very unrealistic, if not deceitful, about what the facts are in Haiti. Now, what we do, in part, is go to the courts. Again, another institution coming in. Bring a big lawsuit on behalf of the Haitians claiming political asylum. All their 5,000 applicants, claims denied as frivolous. Mass hearings back in '78. Challenge that legally. 7-week trial, 75% of the evidence presented relates to political and economic conditions in Haiti, and a federal judge, also appointed by Richard Nixon, by no means a liberal, radical judge, makes the following kind of issues these findings of fact, which says things like, this courtroom has been populated by the ghosts of individual Haitians, including unknown numbers who have been deported by the United States to face arbitrary imprisonment, torture, and death by starvation and disease in Haitian prisons. That the State Department's reporting on economic and political conditions in Haiti is, quote, unworthy of belief, end quote. I could go on and on and on. Federal judge, 70 pages of findings of fact about a foreign country. State Department obviously strongly condemned the State Department. State Department's not happy with that, but it's a new institutional role. More recently, the Mariel exodus, coupled with the ongoing, continuing influx of Haitians and the politics of South Florida, resulted in the proposals that I earlier summarized, which in addition to interdiction include everybody gets arrested, gets put in jail until they can be deported or maybe granted asylum, proposals for significant changes in the asylum process, and proposals that David also did mention about emergency powers that the President is seeking that would enable him, upon declaration of an emergency, to close seaports, close airports, call in the Coast Guard, the Marines, the Army, the Navy to seal the borders. Now, I've got real problems with that. And I think it's a little, and I don't think, I mean, wholly apart from the ethics of it, I don't think it's smart. It's impractical. And yet, it may reflect the intensity with which American people feel we've got to get control over our borders. Let me stop with that, except to say one thing, and maybe as we get involved in more particulars to come up. Try and take the high road in a more optimistic view of this range of issues. It's important to remember de Tocqueville and keep the following kind of concept in mind that he had to say about America, that one of the magical things about American society was the concept of self-interest rightly understood. That is, that Americans seemed to be virtuous, not for the sake of being virtuous, but they seem to have recognized culturally that sometimes virtue can be useful. And I think there's a lot about the immigration issue which suggests to us that in this area often we will find, if we're really honest and probing, that the practical thing to do, the self-interested thing to do in just a raw practical sense, also turns out to be the just thing to do, or the right thing to do. And I would hope, I guess that may be ideal, and I think there's some real possibilities, and we should move in that direction. Thank you.
This is benign interdiction. Thank you, Rick. Our third panelist is Julian Sashnik, who's a lawyer who's done a good deal of immigration litigation in the Boston area. Mr. Sashnik.
As I look around, I think I'm probably the oldest panelist, but I have to say that I feel somewhat like the kid who walks into his kitchen, Mama's not home, and there's the cookie jar. This whole area is so fertile for discussion. It's so full of anachronisms and anomalies. I could promise to spend 10 or 15 minutes, but I know that I could probably spend 10 or 15 months discussing it. Notwithstanding my experience as a nuts and bolts lawyer in the area, I've given some thought to what is wrong with the system and have done some preparing for this evening. I was quite unpleased to find out that a copy of the administration's bill, which was submitted on October 22nd in Congress by that great liberal Strom Thurmond, was not available in Boston until yesterday. In fact, government agencies didn't have a copy of it. I obtained a copy of it from a colleague of mine who happened to get hold of one. I think he was in Washington, and I made it available to some of the government agencies. I think that our problem really is twofold, and I think it's important to constantly look at the problems we're faced with in the area of immigration law on a bifurcated basis. First, we have to recognize the fact that we must have an immigration policy in the United States. We have not had a national immigration policy for 25 years or more. As you explore the pattern of migration into the United States, it essentially was based upon the need for bodies. We had the great waves of immigration accompanied by various tragedies that took place. The Irish came when there was a potato famine, but they built our cities. The Chinese came because of famine in China. They built our railroads, et cetera, et cetera. That was in a pre-industrial era. Today, we live in a post-industrial era, and we have to give serious consideration as to whether or not, and I'm not making a value judgment. I think, however, that it has to be addressed, as to whether or not we can afford to take large numbers of people into this country who who are uneducated, unsophisticated, and have very little to add to this country except their broad backs. At a time when, in the final analysis, broad backs are not really necessary. We've got an awful lot of our own people who are unemployed, damn near starving with broad backs, and that's all they've got. Those are some of the issues, and I'm not advocating one side or the other of the policy problem, but those are some of the issues that have to be discussed, and they are not being discussed in the Congress. Instead, they tend to take the old statutes, shift them a little bit, plug some loopholes with the pieces of Band-Aid that are about the size of postage stamps, read the newspapers, listen to the reaction from the constituency, and try to get Congress to pass asinine, and I mean asinine bills, such as the one which I read yesterday and today, with all due respect to Mr. Hiller. He is a Harvard graduate, I must say, and it is foolish. Let us try to examine for the moment. Oh, let me back off for a moment. Why do we have, sorry, I'll buy you a drink later to make up for that. Well, I'm not used to dealing with highfalutin fellas. I've got these people at the Immigration Service I deal with all the time, and they're so damn demoralized by the benign neglect which has been practiced upon them. They're pushovers. You can get anything you want from one of your clients quite lawfully because most of them have just wrung their hands, thrown their hands up in the air and say, it's not worth it. They're told to violate the law. They're ordered to violate the law day in and day out, and they're so demoralized by it that they really, very bright, capable people, they just laugh. I had a case a while back of an Argentinian doctor who lied in his application for admission to and the fact that he's Argentinian is of no consequence. I just mentioned that he's from there. Lied in his application for admission to the United States, filed a fraudulent application to remain here, left the United States for a short period of time, fraudulently applied for another visa to enter the United States. It was patent. It was obvious. What happened? He was at one of our local hospitals that has a bit of political weight. They called up a local senator or congressman. And next thing you know, the immigration officer, who was going to turn it down, I mean, he should have turned it down, even though he was one of my clients, patent fraud, was ordered to approve it. That happens day in and day out throughout the service. Political intervention by our legislators is probably one of the worst diseases that we have. They can easily afford to avoid a national immigration policy because they know if they pick up the phone and call the local district director and apply gentle pressure, moral suasion they like to call it, they can pretty much get what they want. And after the people in the Immigration Service are knocked to the floor and bloody by this type of behavior, in comes the hired gun like me. And I can absolutely guarantee that unless somebody is convicted of bringing in 500 pounds of cocaine or something like that with intention to sell, has committed murder in front of the White House or done some other heinous act, I can keep any alien in the United States permanently for the rest of his or her life if they've got enough money. It's easy. It's easy, and I don't mean to suggest that you can bribe immigration officers. That is the rare exception. If you can pay me, I know a lot of loopholes. I can use all kinds of devices. The government invites it. I don't mean the individual immigration service officers, but the government invites it through benign neglect. Why do we have 10, 12, 14, and some of us think as high as 15 million illegal or undocumented aliens in the United States? We've invited it. It may well be that there are certain political problems in Haiti, and more Haitians say, hey, it's time to get out, or I'm going to get shot by the Tonton Macoute. It's a polyglot conglomeration of reasons for it, but in the final analysis, the word's out. We're patsies. Don't worry about it. Get your foot in the door, and they'll never get rid of you. I've had people come to my office with cards that I gave out 10 years ago that have the wrong address and the wrong phone number. And I'm sure my experience is, I actually had a relatively small immigration practice, but an intense interest because my mama and papa got off the boat, and I've always had a great identity with aliens and immigrants. But I have these people walk in with cards that are yellowed and torn and ratty. They find me somehow because I help somebody, and that card gets passed around. It's absolutely amazing. And they know if they find the right person and have enough money to fund the kind of thing that has to be done. And I don't mean dilatory tactics, because I don't engage in dilatory tactics. I find the loopholes in the law. The administration is seriously concerned about litigation. In fact, they really want to do everything except wipe out habeas corpus. let us look at a section of the law which is, I guarantee, going to cause new citizens to be deported from the United States. Very, very interesting and fascinating. I know there's an answer, but I already give you what my response is to the answer after I tell you what the section says. I'm not going to read the particular statutory citations, but it's been changed in 5 different places. They amend certain sections of the statute, and they say, each alien who is required to have documentation seeking entry to the United States, shall appear before an immigration officer. The decision of the immigration officer on admissibility of an alien shall be final and not subject to further agency review or to judicial review. Now, one of the classes of persons to whom the immigration officer who has final authority, you don't go to the courts, you don't do anything. I know you've got habeas corpus, but we'll get into that in a minute, even though it says you can't, is that an alien, and this is really an interesting incongruity. The people that wrote this thing really, I think, confuse new citizens with aliens. An alien who does not present documentary evidence of U.S. citizenship. Now, obviously, if you're a U.S. citizen, you're not an alien. Now, I cross the border all the time, and I'll be damned when I come back from Canada or I take a vacation in the islands or go across to Mexico, if some immigration officer is not going to believe I was born in Brooklyn. They spot it. They're trained to do that. But let's take famous Jose Jimenez, who's coming across the border from Juarez after visiting his family somewhere in the hinterlands of Mexico. He goes through a booth, something like a checkout counter at your local supermarket, and there's somebody standing there, and there's a red light. You stop, and he says, "Where were you born?" etc. And if obviously you don't look as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant as I do, even though my name is Sashnik, there's a little further interrogation. Now, under the present law, which this administration wishes to emasculate, that if there's a question in the mind of the immigration officer, he says, "Sir, would you mind going over there?" And there is what is called a secondary inspection. And there's a further examination that takes place, and if needs be, they'll pick up the phone and say, "Is this your cousin coming in?" Or they do whatever they have to do to verify the bona fides of the person purporting to be an immigrant or a citizen. And then if they're not satisfied, they'll give the person the opportunity to leave the United States or withdraw their application for admission to the United States. If the person says, "Hell no, senor, I'm a Yankee now. I got the piece of paper from the court. I want to stay," then that person is brought into the United States or paroled into the United States and is entitled to a hearing before an immigration judge. He's entitled to a lawyer. He's entitled to all kinds of things. And if he or she is in fact a citizen, I suspect that will, be borne out and shown. Now, let's see what the service has done. The administration wants to do. No secondary inspection, no review by the immigration authorities at the local office, no hearing before an immigration judge, and in fact, no judicial review. Now, there are documented cases where U.S. citizens have been deported by the Immigration Service. And I, mind you, don't mean to put down the Immigration Service, because most of the people that I know working in the service are damn hardworking. They're just discouraged. If they make mistakes, it's because they've got these bags over their head. They're just about ready to give up, especially the brighter ones, the ones that really care about their jobs and care about the function they're performing. There are cases on the books, and I'm sure Rick will bear me out, where the United States courts have ordered the Attorney General of the United States to bring back to the United States citizens who have been deported. Now, that's going to proliferate under this foolish thing. Now, Mr. Hiller is going to say, and here's where I'm anticipating his response, "Oh, we didn't knock out habeas corpus." Will you take poor Jose at the border, or Alphonse in Miami after he gets off the plane from Haiti, or whatever he may be, who speaks with an accent, who's of color or what have you, who doesn't fit the WASP norm that we tend to think of as from watching television. An immigration officer says, "Prove it." And if he can't prove it, I'll read the words of the act, because it goes on to say, "Any alien arriving in the United States who is excluded under this act shall be immediately deported." Now, if there's a plane available, goodbye, Charlie, on that airplane, and off he goes. However, somewhere buried in this massive nonsense is the right of habeas corpus. They were very nice to give it to us. The Constitution says we've got it. They can't take it away from us. Okay? Now, what are you going to do if you're at the border and an immigration officer has got his foot on your backside and he's pushing you back over the border, or he wants to put you on the airplane? Okay? You're not entitled to a lawyer during these proceedings because you're not in the United States. You haven't been admitted. And there's a nice legal fiction that as long as you haven't been lawfully admitted to the United States, due process doesn't apply. But you're a citizen and you say, I'm entitled to due process, and they're pushing you out of the border. Sure, you got habeas corpus rights. Where are you going to get a lawyer? Where are you going to file a case in the United States Court of Appeals when you're sitting in that little checkout booth, as I say, that resembles the local supermarket? Nonsense. This is the kind of thing, by the way, and I do believe that it's an earnest attempt on the part of the administration to solve some of the problems which are not their doing. This is what they're trying to do is eliminate some of the problems that have resulted from benign neglect in administration after administration after administration. This is not the way to do it. We've got to bite the bullet. We've got to have a national immigration policy. We've got to get to the root cause of our problems. One of the things that Mr. Hiller tells us is that they're going to fund the Immigration Service. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. It's not fair to tell tales out of school, but I think one of the foundations of their immigration policy is this unlawful employment business, because if people can't eat, they're not going to stay here. Yet they exempt employers who employ 4 or more people. Mr. Hiller gives us a statistic, but I challenge him because I don't think the statistic is correct, that only 5% of the unlawful or undocumented aliens work in these areas. I know where my clients work. Most of them work in smaller, we'll call them cottage industries. They work as maids, domestics. They work in gas stations and so forth. If you work in a factory where there are 45 Hispanics or Haitians or Russians or whatever the ethnic group is, and they tend to cloister together, there is this ethnocentricity which is perpetuated by people in this country. We've got the North End in Boston and South Boston where theoretically the Irish live and so forth. The same thing happens with aliens, whether they're unlawful or otherwise. They're easy marks. The immigration man won't go out and just say, okay, I'm going to get that one person. He's going to go to a factory where he's going to get 50. So therefore, the concentration of unlawful aliens or undocumented aliens is not in the large facilities. It is in the small ma and pa facilities. And therefore, most of them aren't even going to get touched. Now, who's going to enforce this section of the statute? It's going to be enforced by the Immigration Service. Which officers of the Immigration Service? Well, their own police department. They call them investigators. Do you know that there are 750 investigators in the Immigration Service in the entire United States? They are the ones who are charged with the responsibility of ferreting out unlawful aliens. I mean, it's absurd. It's ludicrous. Now, they will bring people in from wages and hours and labor and industries. They'll get the federal marshals and they'll give them cowboy boots and everything else. But unless they really intend to make the hard decision, and I happen to agree with this, by the way. This proposal of the administration is not a new one. It was first proposed by Congressman Peter Odino in about, I think, 1970, and successive Congresses have turned it down. I'm glad to see that at least it's being brought out of from underneath the covers and being paid attention to. If they really mean that they want to stop the flow of unlawful aliens, then this is probably the way to do it. But they've got to beef up the Immigration Service substantially, and they've got to eliminate this proscription of allowing a little violation of the law so long as you've only got 3 other employees. It's kind of like being a little bit pregnant. You know, it's okay. It's okay to have an illegal alien. We'll forgive that, providing you don't have too many of them. I think that's nonsense. I don't think that there's any solution to the problem unless we bite the bullet and do what has to be done. And so far, their attempt, as memorialized in this proposed legislation, is no answer. It's another Band-Aid that's being pasted on top of an already bad situation. Just one more second before I relinquish. The Haitian interdiction. I have here before me, again recently received, a copy of the presidential order, which was entered on September 29th. It says we're going to get the Coast Guard to stop boats on the high seas. We're going to stop and board vessels where there is reason to believe the vessels are engaged in irregular transportation of persons. Well, I don't know who makes that decision, but we'll pass. and they are called upon to return the vessel and the passengers to the country from whence they came. It says, provided, however, and this is a palliative, but it doesn't work, no person who was a refugee will be returned without his consent. That means if you interdict a boatload of Haitians or Cubans or anybody else, and there's a refugee on board, you won't send them back. I commend to you, I don't often do it because I think it's a piece of garbage, the editorial in the Boston Globe last Sunday. They describe an interdiction, and I think it's also been reported in the media otherwise. United States Coast Guard officials pick up a boat. They take everybody on board. Immigration officers begin what is effectively a cursory examination of these people on the high seas in the presence of a uniformed officer of the Haitian government. Now, if you were afraid of persecution back in Haiti, if you wanted to be an asylee in the United States, the first thing you say is, Duvalier is no good, he steals my money, they're corrupt, and so forth. And if you know that there's a decent chance that you're going to be sent back to Haiti, would you say such a thing in front of a uniformed Haitian government official? Nonsense. Therefore, this administration has said that no Haitian who is interdicted on the high seas will be allowed into the United States. That's a cop-out. These words, no person who is a refugee will be sent back. It doesn't mean a damn thing because, in effect, they're preventing these people from making a legitimate claim of asylum. Thank you.
Our fourth panelist is Professor Michael Piori from MIT.
It's real hard to talk about this issue or make sense out of it in 15 minutes, or in an hour if you put the whole panel together. And I guess that what I'd like to try and do is make one basic point, and the point I think is an extension is to try and develop the point with which Rick Schwartz ended. That the self-interested thing to do in this area is the right thing to do. It seems to me that the way to understand what that point means to me is the following. There are really two ways to conceive or understand the immigration process that's going on. One is that you look at what's going on as a mass of people or something which is washing up on our shores. And you see a mass out there of black people or brown people or Chinese people or Jewish people, but you see them, however, as just some big mass. What's going to make those either good or bad policy depends on the way in which they are conceived. And what I have against the immigration policy of this administration and of the previous administration as well is that they are conceived in terms of this a conception of immigration which just sees a mass of people out there of various different kinds being washed up or kind of invading this country, and doesn't see the immigration process in a way in which it has any kind of structure to it, any form. Now, if you see that's the point. One of that is to us, and then I want to get in this more specific, some kind of form. The way to try to go into that is working with the form, going around the edges, in some sense getting it at the margin where it's changing and developing over time. And that is the kind of selfish way to control. You cannot control this thing by trying to push back this whole flood of humanity. What you have to do is somehow kind of form the institutions of immigration policy in a way in which they catch the structure of the immigration process as it's developing. That's point number one. It's the self-interest. All right, a good policy is going to recognize that the policy has a certain form. Now, let me just try and give you one illustration of that. You have a pattern of immigration, of Mexican immigration, that has been going on for over a century. But that has and the most updated version of it, the newest kind of patterns of Mexican immigration, are now 15 years old. Those patterns are extremely well entrenched. They have roots both in American society and in Mexican society. To go and try and change those patterns at this point of time through a program like a guest worker program, by adding a new guest worker program to the thing, is really it's quite unlikely that you're going to be able to do much to structure the Mexican immigration in that way. What might happen is that you'll open up a whole new pattern of Mexican immigration if you don't happen to lay down this guest worker program on top of the existing pattern of immigration. And it's going to be very hard to do. That is, the best you could possibly do with this experimental guest worker program is absorb existing patterns of Mexican immigration into it. But it's extremely unlikely that you're going to do that because you're opening up a pattern that's going to happen one way or another to conform to certain kinds of random administrative elements to it that is going to involve missions either overt or covert with the Mexican government that's going to have certain groups that they want to favor and that they want absorbed into the guest worker program and so on. So it's extremely unlikely that you're going to have a program that really follows the existing pattern. On the other hand, you have a whole new pattern of immigration opening up at the moment. It's Haiti. It is a major political problem, and it is a new pattern. And presumably, if you could understand what that pattern is, you could attempt to control it and channel it in some way. All right? And if I'm going to take 50,000 new slots of something and try and use them to channel an immigration stream, I would definitely be wanting to work on the Haitian immigration and not on the Mexican immigration. Instead, what are you trying to do with Haitian immigration? You're not trying to channel it, to understand its structure or anything. You're trying to sweep back the tide with this interdiction on the high seas. Right? You'll never control it that way. But you could control it if you institutionalize it by using it. I'm not advocating to have a guest worker program with Haiti, but that you have some kind of, that you use that freedom that you're in, that element, that margin that you're now developing in the system to try and catch and develop and channel the flow of Haitian immigrants, because that's where you have the problem. So that's the self-interested thing to do. It's also the right thing to do. If you understand that what you're dealing with is people who may not just like you and me, but are human beings in the same sense that all of us are human beings, then you can't possibly be coming up with the kinds of policies that involve these kinds of proposals. They have got to be, that is, you don't treat human beings that way. And you could not be conceiving of these policies if you really had a conception of these immigration streams as consisting of human beings. All right? Now, having said that, I guess I'd like to make two or three kind of more specific of points that go on in a kind of general way with what's wrong with this administration's policy, although in many ways I think this administration's policy is just carrying out in some ways the logic of the Carter administration policy. And so I think it's a little unfair to overdo how much this particular the problems are specific to this to Reagan as opposed to the kind of last 5 or 10 years of thinking about social policy in this country. One thing about immigration that's important to know, I think, is this gap between the law and the budget. The problem is not that you don't have enough law. It's that you don't have enough budget. Okay? And that gap between the law and the budget introduces into this thing enormous abuses. All right? How do you think that is the immigration? Here you have an immigration service that knows, without any investigation, that knows right now where there are more undocumented workers than it could possibly pick up in a year. The way in which you get something like this Argentinian case is, what do they care if they let that is, they can fill any quota they want with somebody else. If the Argentinian gets through, they'll just go up and pick out somebody else and deport them or try and deport them. And so you get kinds of abuses that are just normal in this field, like who are the people who get deported? Oh, somebody who breaks up with their lover, all right? And the lover reports them to the immigration service. That's the kind of that is a major criteria. If you asked what that is, maybe a substantial percentage of people who are deported are picked up for that reason, or they have a fight in the shop, and the employer reports them, or a fellow worker reports them. It's very haphazard. And that is, a lot of people talk about how unfair it is to have all these undocumented workers here, where you have these long lines of people waiting for legal visas abroad. Well, it's true that is unfair, although not quite as if the thing is a lot more complicated than that. But the major unfairness comes in how you determine who gets picked up here and who isn't, and that comes out of the fact that the budget of the Immigration Service is so small relative to the amount of laws that they have to enforce that they end up using these kind of arbitrary criteria in terms of where they enforce the law. So what we need in this area, in terms of equitable administration, is less regulation, less laws, and more money. All right? And unless you're going to fund the Immigration Service, you're really, and it's true that it is a change to be talking about the kinds of funding that the increases in funding that the administration is talking about. But unless they really come through, it's the notion that you're going to have a change in policy is absurd just by regulation. Now, the same thing I think is true, although I'm running out of time, of the question of employer sanctions. Employer sanctions are not going to work without an identification card. They're just not. And unless you're willing to spend, if it costs, I doubt it costs $2 billion, but it probably does cost in the neighborhood of 500. That is $0.5 to $1 billion. And unless you're willing to spend that kind of money, you're just putting in more law, and you're somehow giving more discretion to the service to introduce these kind of arbitrary elements into the process. Now, I guess I want to make one other point in what probably I have very little time left anyway. I'll steal 2 or 3 more minutes. The kind of image that guides our immigration policy is that what is running that is what we have to contend with is the income gap between this country and foreign countries, and there's a certain logic to that. It seems like particularly if you've ever been to Haiti or to some parts of Mexico, as if the income gap is so large that all those people are just dying to come to this country, and we're going to if we don't have a new immigration policy, we're going to be flooded with them. But the facts do not have anything to do with that logic. The income differentials, as Rick said before in relation to Haiti, but certainly in relation to all the other countries, they have always been there. If anything, they are less wide now than they have been in the past. The people who are coming from these countries are not coming from the poorest parts of the country. They're just not. Many of them are coming from the wealthier parts of the country. So that the process and structure of immigration which is going on, and to go back to the original point that there is a process and structure, is not a process and structure that is being dominated by an income differential. There are a lot of other variables which are governing this process that are at least as important and maybe more important than the income differential, and that mediate the impact of that differential. And hence, to make a policy under the pressure or the scare that we are going to be flooded with the low-income people of the world just has nothing to do with the reality of the immigration process. Well, I guess I'll stop on that point.
Thanks very much, Professor Piori. What we're going to do is give each of the panelists a couple of minutes to reply to each other, and we'll just proceed through the order of speakers. And if you don't keep it short, I'll try to, but why don't you take 2 or 3 minutes. Mr. Hiller, you first.
Well, I'm somewhat at a loss. All the more interesting pejorative adjectives have been used up earlier in the evening, but nevertheless, I'll do the best I can. Starting with you, Sashnik. That's right. That's right. No, I should say, Mr. Sashnik, please know that if I ever have the slightest immigration problem, I will look as hard as I can for one of your tattered calling cards, and no matter how many times you change your address, I will find you in Boston. there are a couple of things that I just sort of objective things I wanted to clear up. The one I was most bothered by, I have to say, is the editorial in the Globe, which I had not seen, and I think it might be helpful if I explain for just a minute the circumstances of the Haitian interdiction program. And I wanted, by the way, without being melodramatic about it, to bring into that subject the very sad facts in the last couple of weeks that have been witnessed in Florida. What occurs when a Coast Guard boat meets a Haitian boat on the high seas, and this was a somewhat extraordinary one off of Haiti because the Haitian boat was sinking at the time that the Coast Guard came upon it, and all of the 56 who were on that boat had to be taken onto the Coast Guard cutter. They weren't terribly far from Haiti. They were quite far from the United States. And those persons who were then removed from that boat were all individually and personally interviewed by immigration officers with a Haitian officer nowhere near the process. There is a Haitian sort of liaison officer serving on the Coast Guard cutter for dealing sort of over the radio and whatnot with the Haitian Navy and with the civil authorities for the coordination of the return of these people. But as you know, it would be appalling if they were anywhere near the process and they are not. They never see the Haitians, and they're never seen by the Haitians, and that I can give you the most unqualified assurance about. Because we are the concern, the principal concern, and one of the principal arguments against an interdiction program at sea is the possibility that a meritorious claim of somebody who's coming from Haiti who does fear persecution there, and there have been documented cases of it, and in many respects, in certain parts of Haiti, maybe the term kleptocracy is fitting. I truly believe that that's not the case with a large part of the flow of persons from Haiti. I've been in conversations, and I suppose everyone's views, having distinctive institutional roles to play, may be suspect in this. But I was talking with the chief of mission of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, whom one would suppose would be fairly solicitous of such persons, and it was his view, and I don't want to quote him because he didn't want to be quoted on the figure, but the last time the UN High Commissioner reviewed a significant sampling of claims of Haitian refugees, the percentage was quite low, well under 10%. Now that's the experience as with the Immigration Service has overall in history are in numbers that are, again, well under 10%, but they're not so out of line with what the United Nations High Commissioner estimated that at least I am not concerned, although to be sure you have to be continually watchful, that I do not personally believe that most of the people coming over from Haiti, although driven by the most sort of grinding poverty, fit what is a legal and maybe somewhat harsh definition contained in the law, but to come to the United States without documentation and to remain as a refugee, you have to be able to provide some evidence that you have a fear of official persecution. And when people do that, either on the when interviewed by an immigration officer, they are permitted to remain in the United States, and there can be disputes in individual cases. And I'm aware of the Judge King case and of the evidence that he culled there, and some of the evidence there was substantial. That in some cases there's persecution, and I would not for a minute claim that nobody who comes from Haiti is entitled to claim persecution. And one of the things that we're most eager to do as the hearings get underway, the exclusion hearings get underway in Florida, is with with sort of thorough legal representation on both sides. We would like to consolidate many of the asylum claims for sort of a joint airing of the general conditions in Haiti. I know many times the evidence isn't amply brought out in the individual exclusion hearings, and I think as a background then for airing the particular claims that are raised by Haitian persons, it would do a great deal for the credibility of the Immigration Service's determinations if we had this thoroughgoing airing of the conditions there. And I've got to say, and the frustration you've heard expressed here fairly reflects one of the principal problems of the Immigration Services. They both aren't able to do a good job, and they enjoy virtually no credibility. Okay, I'll quickly jump on. And one or two other points on the question of the exclusion determination. The our effort in revising the procedures for persons who enter without documents is to simplify, and at least as caricatured, you have the sense we certainly have simplified it, the numbers of levels of administrative and judicial review presently available. At this point, and this I think is illustrative, so if you'll indulge me for a second, when a person enters the United States without documents, and if they want, for whatever reason, to raise a claim of asylum, they may do so first before the district director of the Immigration Service, then again in the context of their exclusion hearing before the immigration judge, again before the Board of Immigration Appeals within the Department of Justice, again on a petition for habeas corpus in the Federal District Court, and then on appeal to the Court of Appeals, and can seek certiorari if they like. I don't think it can be seriously contended that that number of steps is necessary to fairly render a decision on a claim of this sort. And what we are attempting to do is to streamline, to cut back somewhat those levels of review. And the way we would anticipate it is there would be one level of the administrative decision, one administrative review, and then in the case of persons who came in without documents, habeas corpus review of the fairness in the district court of the fairness of the procedures that were followed. And that's what's written into the bill, and that's what we're asking Congress to look at.
I'm sorry to cut this off, but we've got to save a little time for questions, and we should be out of here, I'm told, by 10 o'clock. Rick Schwartz, do you have something you'd like to add?
I'll be very quick. Just want to underscore Mike Peore's emphasis on the human character of immigration. One, obviously, for the moral obligations that reality reminds us of, and secondly, for the reason that Mike really emphasizing, these are human beings, motivated by the things that motivate human beings, and whether it's economic opportunity, or children are starving, or you're subject to political persecution, or your kin are elsewhere, or as a result of the communications and transportation revolutions, expectations of Haitians or Salvadorians or people in India are different today than they might have been 30 years ago, because they can see the world that they couldn't see 30 years ago. I think that's just very important to keep in mind in looking at the practical wisdom of some of these proposals. And the second thing on interdiction, I won't go into all the things that David discussed, just a couple quick facts. In 1979, the U.S. vigorously condemned Malaysia and Thailand for interdicting boats of Indo-Chinese refugees on the ground that it was inhumane and it violated international legal norms. Now, that was 1979, and I don't know what's different in 1981. They feel they can go full speed ahead on the Haitians as opposed to say the Haitians are refugees. In 1939 was the last time the U.S., to my knowledge, turned away boats of people seeking refuge, and those were German Jews fleeing Germany. And at that time, when the U.S. denied entry and required those refugees to return, Nazi Germany was saying these are all economic migrants. The Jews are looking for economic opportunity. And the U.S. government adopted that factual assertion in justifying turning away the Jews in 1939. Now, I don't mean to suggest in any way that Haiti is the same as Nazi Germany. But I think the issues of principle presented are very similar in that we should all be very troubled. And finally, on interdiction, I don't think the issue is whether or not the Haitian naval officer happens to be in the head at the time that the asylum interview is being conducted. The fact that he's on board is one thing. The fact that the United States government could even consider seriously that kind of policy, to me, is what the American public ought to judge. And I'll stop with that.
Julian Sashnik?
I have in my possession a copy of a letter which was written by an acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State to the Chief Clerk of the United States Immigration Court in New York. Chief Clerk was directed by the immigration judge to make inquiry of the State Department concerning an application for asylum, because under the law, when an application for asylum is lodged in the United States, an advisory opinion of the Secretary of State is required. In this particular case, it was an Iranian Jew. If you're familiar with the writings of the Ayatollah Khomeini, whether you feel strongly about the revolution or not, among some of the things that he has said is that the Jews are the vermin and scourge of the earth, etc., etc. I think he doesn't like Jews, to say the least. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State made the following givens. He said the applicant is, these are facts, they accept them, generally believed to have Zionist sympathies and to support Israel. He has visited, studied, or lived temporarily in Israel, has been in the United States, and has publicly expressed views contrary to those of the present regime in Iran. Although we know that in the continuing revolutionary turmoil there have been instances of violence and discrimination against Jews generated by religious zealots and bigots, we are aware that there's been official sanctions against individuals for alleged ties to Zionism and activities on behalf of its national interest. Several leading figures and a number of others in the Jewish community have been arrested and detained. They left out shot. And there are reports indicating that action against Jews may be becoming more widespread, even though not centrally directed. There is understandably concern over the situation of Jews in Iran today and a feeling of insecurity in the Jewish community. Nevertheless, each request for asylum rests on its own merits. In our view, this requirement has not been sustained by the applicant. Fascinating. A Zionist visited Israel, espouses anti-Khomeini sentiments, and goodness, I read out the rest of it. And our State Department does not believe this person is a bona fide applicant for asylum. I wonder what they think of some poor peasant from Haiti or some other place. This is a pretty stacked deck. This guy clearly is a legitimate asylee, quite aside from the merits of the Iranian Revolution. No question about that. He's got a lot going for him. So if you're some poor peasant from Haiti, forget about it. And in this case, they said no. I think this administration just doesn't want any more refugees and doesn't want any more asylum. They ought to say so. They're fooling us by saying otherwise.
Professor Piori?
Well, I guess I just want maybe to continue in this vein. I don't want to beat it. But you go back to the Haiti case. Now, I know very little about the process of Haitian migration. But, for example, it appeared in the newspapers that this ship with the drownings was connected to a smuggling ring. Now, that makes sense in terms of what we know about other migrations, that when you get large-scale migration going, that there generally are major smuggling operations involved. And the way to go after those operations is to go after the smuggling rings. And there is a process of doing that. You can infiltrate these rings, you can investigate them, you can track them down, and in general you can stop them. You can't do it. It's not as impressive politically as it is. That is impressive. It doesn't impress the American public, political public, so much as these grand gestures of streamlining court procedures. But it is much more. It's both much more humane, and in the end, is probably going to be much more effective. Now, that, it seems to me, is where where the attention of an administration which is really interested in immigration policy ought to be directed. And there is a lot of work to do there in the Immigration Service, because for some reason or other, the Immigration Service has not been able to pull together smuggling investigation units. For example, on the Mexican border, They can't coordinate smuggling investigations among the different border stations on the border. They can't. The service can't do it internally. I don't quite understand why, but what happens is as soon as you start going after a smuggling operation at one port of entry on the Mexican border, the whole operation moves to another port of entry. And they know that in the service, but the jealousies within the service are such that they have been unable to get the internal administrative coordination necessary. And it is that kind, again, it's understanding this thing as a process. It's understanding the Immigration Service and the administration problems internally which it has as part of a process that is going to be critical towards getting immigration under control and not interdiction on the high seas.
Well, we'd like to open it up to questions now. And if you have questions, I'd just like to ask that you keep your questions brief and succinct, and you can direct them to any one member of the panel or to the panel as a whole. Yes?
Well, we can, and those are documented cases. I'm sorry to say. In fact, we just indicted in the Southern District of Florida one of the most. I've never heard a story more horrible. It was a large boat. It was one of these mother boats that left Haiti with 200 or more people on it. It got the United States with like 150 people on it. What they were doing, they put in Cuba and taken on. They were provisioned only with sugar and water. All this is alleged. I mean, I'm just sort of telling you from the indictment. They were extorting money for this sugar and water. It was the only provision they carried on the boat. Anybody they couldn't pay, just numbers of them, large numbers of them died of exposure. Anybody who protested was either mutilated with sticks, as you say, or hacked with machetes and thrown overboard. We're legally somewhat at law. We're going to prosecute them to the extent we can. The problem is, in some of those cases, proving jurisdiction that it happened in United States waters. I mean, we'll throw the book at them, and if we're lucky, and if they did this, they could be put away for about 30 years. But we are trying to focus on the smugglers, and we're trying particularly to seize out the trafficker ships. Our intelligence on it is getting better and better. We have a fairly good idea of large numbers of the people and the boats that are involved, and gradually we hope to stop it. Well, to the extent that you can, and they give they give lots of assurances and indicate they'll be cooperative, but candidly, you have to be somewhat skeptical of the degree of their cooperation. So we try to work with them, but we're certainly doing the most we can through our own law enforcement efforts.
We've got lines of people at both mics. I'll just alternate mics, I think. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, this question is directed to David Hiller. In the Helsinki Accords, the U.S. pledged itself to facilitating freer movement across international borders. That agreement noted the particular importance of allowing people to visit and be reunited with their families, and also the importance of encouraging travel by people participating in international meetings and congresses. Yet, the INS, under the Reagan administration, has continued to deny a visa to a Filipino woman seeking to join her family in the U.S., has deported a Canadian man without allowing him access to counsel, has attempted to exclude participants in an international parade, and has gone to court to ensure that they can continue to do this. This is just the latest chapter of a long and disgraceful story, and the story is that these people, and many others, were refused entry because they're gay and lesbian. Current INS policy and practice is that gays will be harassed and summarily deported, even though being gay is not illegal, not a disease, and not even grounds for denial of naturalized citizenship. The State Department's Human Rights Office said that this policy is in violation of the Helsinki Agreements, and I agree. The INS policy is a disgrace and an international embarrassment. Protests were held recently in 10 cities, 10 foreign cities, 8 American cities as well. And my question to you, Mr. Hiller, is whether this administration intends to continue this persecution and harassment against people attempting to enter this country simply because they're gay and lesbian.
Our problem with that is that the law has in it, and it's an old requirement in my view, quite archaic and objectionable, and should be stricken from the law. There's written into the Immigration Act a ground of exclusion, as hideous as you and I both might think it is, that says persons who are homosexual cannot be admitted into the United States. At this point, we are. I must say too that within the next few weeks there are going to be hearings before Senator Simpson's committee on the grounds of exclusion, and that will be one of the principal ones focused on. I, for one, totally agree with you. I think it's preposterous to have in the law.
Well, if that's the case, then why there was a federal district court that enjoined enforcement of this law for the district surrounding San Francisco to allow people to attend the Gay Freedom Parade in San Francisco. The INS chose to appeal that ruling and is presently appealing in federal appeals court. And if we agree, that's the Justice Department, if we agree that this provision doesn't belong there, then why are you appealing?
The Immigration Service and the Justice Department are lawyers for the Congress in a case like that. And while we might hardly recommend, and I would hope we would recommend, that provision be stricken from the law, when someone brings a challenge, and you may think this is a foolhardy thing, but lawyers are obliged, even government lawyers are obliged to defend their client. And our client in that case was the Congress, and they may do sort of stupid things or outrageous things, but even when they do, the United States Department of Justice has to go in and defend the Congress. I do hope they change that provision.
We need to move on to a question over here.
Mr. Hiller, the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act is quite strong in its provisions as written. It seems to me that the problem has been through successive administrations that there's been no willpower to enforce the immigration law, that even though the Attorney General has recently said the law is the law, certain laws are more important than others. I'm waiting to hear an important national figure say once to the American public that it's unpatriotic to hire or harbor illegal aliens. It's never been presented to the public in that fashion. And this administration is no different from the previous administrations in that regard. U.S. attorneys under the present administration, when presented with criminal violations of the immigration law by the Immigration Service, routinely decline to prosecute entry without inspection, perjury and fraud before immigration officers, returning after deportation, failure to register, and on and on. It's just not a priority. President Reagan, while campaigning, said that he was intrigued with the possibility of open borders with Mexico. Anybody can come at any time. Norman Brayman, the Cadillac dealer extraordinaire and the nominee of this administration for INS commissioner, stated that he admired the Cuban-American families that hired the boats that went to Mariel and brought the illegal Cubans to the United States.
Your question? I'm sorry. We need to...
I'm questioning your commitment to enforcing the immigration law in view of all of these contradictions that have continued into this administration, and even serious ones. I mean, we've talked about homosexuality. It's illegal for a homosexual to be admitted to the United States. Instead of changing the law, the Attorney General has ordered the Immigration Service to ignore the law, that when an INS officer at an airport or a port of entry encounters a homosexual, he's not to question that person unless that person wants to make an issue of it.
There's no such order by the Attorney General.
Yes, there is.
Absolutely.
Those are the persons that wanted to make a test case of the issue.
Mr. Hiller, do you want to respond to the question?
Well, are you...
Yeah, the question is, where is the commitment of this administration in view of all of these contradictions?
Well, I'm not sure all of those are contradictory. For example, the case of the limitations on the U.S. Attorney's Office. They don't prosecute every case that they can. I regret that to some extent they've made immigration cases a lower priority, and I know they're being instructed to raise those priorities. The President indicated he was intrigued by the idea of open borders. I take it from the policy that he's no longer as infatuated with it. There are a number of other things you mentioned. I can't, give you a general defense.
How about this one?
I know the Attorney General is committed to this, and
Well, General Haig decided after the immigration...
No, you can't. I will not sit here and have to take responsibility for General Haig also.
General Haig was...
that really...
If you want to expand on your question, but we want to move on to other questions. Is there a further question you want to put to Mr. Hiller?
One last one. General Haig was not pleased with the Immigration Service when we started to deny certain Indo-Chinese pseudo-refugees refugee status. So he complained to the Attorney General, who ordered the U.S. Immigration District Director in Hong Kong to admit every single Indo-Chinese in the United Nations refugee camp in Indochina. They are automatically presumed to be refugees. The Attorney General issued the order. The professionals on the scene say these people do not meet the definition of refugees. Does this indicate respect for the immigration law?
Well, you're aware of the fact that temporary presumption is no longer in effect.
Wasn't it, in fact, illegal to order it in that fashion? Why didn't the Attorney General resist it?
Not on the basis of the facts that we were provided.
They're not refugees. Your own State Department and INS officials have reported to you these people are not refugees. The UN agrees with that.
Well, it's certainly not the view of the...
I don't think it's fair to subject... I mean, Mr. Hiller has argued for enforcement. He gave you a whole program arguing for enforcement of...
It's a farce. It's not going to enforce anything.
Sit down, man. Sit down. Tired of
Questioner, yes.
I'd like to first thank the other three panelists, and we're not ignoring you because we didn't appreciate what you said, but I think because we appreciate that it's a very complex
Because you didn't
issue.
appreciate what I said.
Mr. Hiller, it's not a direct attack on you as a person, but on the policies that you represent. First of all, you mentioned an attempt in Congress to repeal the provision of this of the law banning immigration of people who have perverse personality characteristics, for example. And that's in the same Congress where the Family Protection Act is purporting to prohibit any kind of federal aid or assistance to people who even speak out about their sexuality. And I don't believe that the administration is being very honest about this. But that's not my issue. That's not my question. My question comes down to the really, really dangerous civil liberties nightmares that the legislation you're proposing is just opening up. I remember you mentioning a 2-year transition time. I don't remember what it's for, but 2 years is 1984. You're going to be wanting us to carry national identity cards. You're not going to be picking up illegal aliens. You're going to be picking up people who speak out in forums against policies of the government that they don't like, who are draft resistors, things of that sort.
Well, let me make, perhaps I misspoke. Let me make very clear that the administration has no intention to propose or endorse a national identity card.
This year. But in 2 years, you're going to need it. How are you going to find these aliens you wish to exclude? You admitted that there's a necessity to have some way of processing those people.
Well, we're proposing to do that on the basis of existing forms of identification.
I just think the civil liberties things are so incredibly dangerous.
Well, we're on the
and
same
with
side
the other
then
legislation that comes up out of this administration, which is cutting off access to the courts, which is tearing to shreds the First Amendment, things like that. I'm just frightened for the next few years for this country.
I'd like later we can take on what you mean by the tearing to shreds the First Amendment. But,
Rick, did you have a comment on that?
Sure, yeah, just very briefly. I share your concerns on a wide range of these proposals. However, on employer sanctions, my information about the White House thinking on the ID card issue is that very honestly, there were some civil libertarian concerns that Martin Anderson in particular and some others in the administration had over about the ID card, coupled with cost, coupled with an analysis that I agree with, that if he has set up a new ID card system, people can just use fraudulent aliens that are illegally here and use fraudulent documents to get the new counterfeit-proof Social Security cards. So that I think there are a range of fairly legitimate reasons, including civil libertarian concerns, that has led the administration to reject ID cards. However, I think they should have rejected the whole employer sanctions concept, and that the civil libertarian concerns I showed on this particular issue, I don't think they're showing in other areas involving immigration.
Yes.
I have a straightforward question, which would appreciate a non-philosophical answer, just nuts and bolts. If Attorney General Smith, this is to either Mr. Sashnik or Hiller, if Attorney General Smith said tomorrow morning that as of January 1st, 1982, immigration inspection officers will visit businesses and issue $250 fines per head of worker who has not legitimately shown his employer either a naturalization certificate, a birth certificate, or any other existing document that shows that he is not an illegal alien. If this were to happen, wouldn't this begin to stem the attractiveness of America to illegal workers as an employer?
Which of you wants to?
Can't do it. It would be clearly unlawful and unconstitutional. The statute, I'll give them this much, they said knowingly employ. It's like the statute we have in Massachusetts. You can get picked up by the fuzz for being in an automobile or a house where there's marijuana. However, they have to show you knew there was marijuana in the car or there was marijuana in the house. So you have to knowingly employ an undocumented or unlawful alien. There is an awful lot of forgery out there. That's why I don't think anything other than a foolproof national ID system will work. In Boston, for example, or anywhere in the country, if you're an alien and you want to work, I can tell you how to do it. It's very easy. You go down to the immigration office, pay $5 and file an application for anything, an extension, whatever they give out. They'll give you a computer printout that shows you file an application. The cheapest is $5. Sometimes you can get it for nothing if you find one that they don't charge you a fee for. Okay? And then it's so easy to forge the stamp that they use. It's about, a 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch, and it says employment authorized, BOS, and then somebody scribbles some initials there. Okay? I mean, you can get those things in a 5 and dime or make one up yourself. It's so easy. So that's all the employer has to have. And he's off the hook. He makes a Xerox of it, and he says, here, I got it. I'm sorry?
What document is that?
That's employment authorization. It's given out like they give out aspirins in the Army or APCs or whatever they used to call them. I mean, it's fairly common, and if you're not entitled to one, it's so easy to forge, it's absurd. The moment this system goes into effect, you won't have to bother getting the plastic-coated ID cards, the so-called green card, the Zenith, the great thing that all the aliens want, immigrant status. They're all forms of identification. If you're Hispanic, get a friend down in Puerto Rico to get your Puerto Rican birth certificate, and you say, here I am, I was born in Puerto Rico. How the devil does anybody in immigration know? But even aside from that, the employer's happy. He's got a photocopy of a Puerto Rican birth certificate. You're Hispanic. He's off the hook. There'll be a great traffic in this stuff, so that this employer sanction won't work without a national ID system, and therefore I agree with the young man who spoke up before. They'll have to get it in a year or two. Otherwise, this thing won't work. Absolutely impossible.
Do you have any further comment, Mr. Hiller, on that?
I don't think we're going to be. Are we out of? I don't think we're going to be moving to the national ID card in that period of time because of those objections, and I do think that through more conventional enforcement measures, the kind of thing that you described will work, and I think you've captured the gist of what the program is.
I'm afraid we've got time for only one more question, and that's you.
Are there any proposals in the Reagan administration for lessening the reasons directly for immigration, which would be, are there any proposals to give economic aid to those countries and social programs and birth control programs so that there won't be so much pressure for immigration? Because I know that the Reagan administration is regressive on birth control, it's regressive on economic aid to the poor and to the third world. It's regressive on long-range solutions, and this seems to be the only one, other than a militaristic one. Yeah. And it's certainly regressive on social revolution, which is perhaps essential besides demographic transition, economic improvement. But are there any proposals to have, say,
well, there are some less revolutionary developmental proposals that the Reagan administration is proposing. I guess dealing in the Caribbean area, one that I take most seriously and I'm most hopeful about, it's just in its infant stages, is the joint Caribbean Basin initiative among Canada, Mexico, the United States, and Venezuela. Now, a problem recently is the Congress in recent years has not been very favorable to the foreign aid programs. In fact, when we go up there with the foreign aid program, you're often very fortunate if you don't have your head handed to you. And the president said down in Cancun, and you can dispute it as either in theory or in practice. What they're trying to do through the Caribbean Basin Project is mostly stimulate additional trade. For example, there would be various limitations that could be dropped, certain labor-intensive products, particularly the textiles and other products that are manufactured in Haiti that are not very generously treated under the United States trade laws, and you could do a great deal by nurturing trade in those principal products of that country, and also they're looking at ways of fostering additional outside investment. There have been groups. In fact, there was a group down there preparing the proposals for the United States when I was just in Haiti, and I think there's a paper that will finalize those proposals. They are, of course, you're right, we were neglectful of those issues for the most part tonight. They're ultimately the only answer, but they do, I don't even want to say it, but they do take time.
Obviously, there's a lot here we could continue discussing. I'm sorry we can't go on tonight. I would like to let you know that there is a reception for the panelists, and any of you would like to come in the living room right through those doors. Is that right? That's where it is? And I want to thank the panelists for being with us tonight. I want to thank Anthony Brown and his associates of the Student Advisory Committee for putting this together. Thank you all for coming.